Wang returning home to Mount Song. By the clear stream and narrow pathway, my horse and carriage follow it at leisure. The water seems to flow along with me. Birds and I are returning home together. A ruined wall near an ancient fairy stage. Autumn sunset floods the hills. Far ahead, beneath Mount Song, my home. Arriving at last, I shall close my door. So here is another of Wang Wei's poems, and as is usual in the ones we've encountered so far, at least in this section of the book, they're all landscape poems describing the loveliness, the pleasures of the retired life, the beautiful views, and the desire or even the imperative for leading the retired life. So this poem is called Returning Home to Mount Song. I think we haven't encountered Mount Song before, but Mount Song is one of the 5 great mountains of China, the Wushan, which were believed to represent, in a way, the poles, the axis mundi of the earth. And they were the 5 great sacred mountains of China since antiquity. The most famous one, there's one for each of the cardinal directions. There's one in the north, one in the south, one in the east, one in the west, one in the center. The most famous is the one in the east, Mount Tai, which we've already encountered in a poem by Du Fu. This one, Mount Song, is the one in the middle. It's in the present-day province of Henan. And like all sacred mountains in China, during the subsequent historical ages, it became a religious site, not only for followers of Chinese folk religion, but for Taoists and Buddhists as well, who built many temples in or the mountain or in its surroundings. In fact, some of those temples are still there. They are the reason why the region has been included in the UNESCO World Heritage List. Anyway, so we know that Wang Wei in his early 20s spent some time retired in Mount Song. As we've talked before, Wang Wei was a split personality. He had a conflict within, which many scholar officials had, but which becomes particularly representative and intense in his case, between the dual desires of following Confucian dictates and serving in office, which he did, and he managed to achieve pretty decent positions and postings. But on the other hand, there's the desire of the Taoistically inclined or the Buddhistically inclined for leaving the world, abandoning the red dust of the world. And, Wang Wei was, his biography seems to point at this conflict being ever present in him and never resolved. And he had periodic stays in which he left office, but he would always go back again, and sometimes he would build retreats close to the capital. That he will do that later in the Chungshan Mountains and in other areas, where he would take leave, especially in his old age, from his official duties and spend a few days living the retired life, the hermit life of the scholar official. So the background for this poem is that Wang Wei, as we've said, has retired from office. He has been serving. In his extreme youth, he served as a reminder for Zhang Juling, which is a poet we've already encountered in this anthology with 5 poems, who managed to achieve a very important position in the early years of Emperor Xuanzong. So he has served in his entourage. Now he's leaving. He's living in the mountain. And the poem, apart from descriptive, especially through the message in the last couplet, clearly seems to point in the direction of transmitting the message, I want to leave the world. I want to lead the retired life from now on. So let's take a look at the poem as usual, as we usually do, couplet by couplet. By the clear stream and narrow pathway, my horse and carriage follow it at leisure. So the poet is returning to Mount Song. So the first image we get is a double image of a clear, beautiful, pure stream, next to it a narrow path. And through that path, at his leisure, there's no hurry, Wang Wei on his horse and carriage is going home. So couple of things to mention about the couplet. First, even if they liked to play at being hermits, Chinese scholar officials were very conscious of their status, of their scholarship and the scholarly knowledge. So even in poems in which they pretend to be gentlemen farmers or living the farmer life, they still include a few clues and indications to point that, but I'm not just a rich farmer. I'm a cultured person. I'm a scholar official, after all. So I'm saying this because, Wang Wei is returning to his retreat, but he's not returning on foot. He's going on a horse and carriage, which were pretty expensive things, which I imagine, only a considerably wealthy person, a scholar official, would have at his disposal. And he's returning at leisure. So this indicates, if we had any doubts, that he's not going in the service of the emperor for doing any official duty, because then he would be expected to be hasting as much as possible. No. He is in his own free time. He's no longer serving in office, so he can go at leisure and enjoy his time. A narrow pathway by a clear stream. So we're in a natural surrounding. The fact that the pathway is narrow is very significant. So I imagine this is real. I mean, this is probably representing the existence of a real path that he was taking to go to his refuge in Mount Song. But, a narrow path evokes many ideas, at least for me. So it's of course a path that is not one of the highways that leads to the capitals or to the big cities. It's almost a mountain path. Yeah. So a narrow path that leads into a very populated, a sparsely populated area, which is good for retreats. The narrow path also brings to mind the path least taken, as in Wallace Stevens' famous poem. Yeah. So this is not the choice that most prefer. Most prefer the highway, the high avenues of power and success. Wang Wei prefers, or seems to be preferring, at least while he wrote this poem and for a few months later, the ideal of the path least taken, of the retired life, of simplicity, even when he could aspire to the golden path of fame and glory and success and officialdom. Second couplet. The water seems to flow along with me. Birds and I are returning home together. So both images of movement, the moving water, the moving birds. Yeah. While going at his leisure, the water is personified. It's given human attributes. Yeah. The water seems to be flowing with me, moving with me, as if water wanted to enjoy my company. Yeah, the birds are also returning home. They're mirroring Wang Wei's own return home. So both images emphasize this idea of harmony with nature. During his travel, Wang Wei is clearly traveling in nature, but he's also in harmony with the nature. His mind, his desires are tuned to his surroundings, to the retired life he is presumably engaging in. Third couplet. A ruined wall near an ancient ferry stage. Autumn sunset floods the hill. So it's late now, and we get a couple of quaint images, autumn images. Remember, autumn is always the preferred season for Chinese poetry because of its melancholy but beautiful associations and images. So while he's traveling, next to the river there is an abandoned ferry stage, with a ruined wall, so a lovely image with religious connotations. You could always suppose, the transience of human efforts, the pointlessness of human efforts, the passage of time, the great devourer, and also the sunset, the end of the day. But it also creates a beautiful image. Both are beautiful images. You have this quaint, abandoned ferry stage, and also the sunlight, the reddish, colourful, intense, purplish sunset flooding with its light all the hills. Finally, the last couplet. We've arrived home. The poet has arrived home. Far ahead, or almost, it's still far ahead beneath Mount Song, my home. Arriving at last, I shall close my door. So the poet hasn't yet arrived at his home, but he can see it now, after a bend in the road perhaps. and he plans for the future. What will I do when I arrive? I'll close my door. That closing of the door is also a symbolic closing of the door. It means I will shut myself away from the world. I will penetrate into the retired life and into the retired life mindset. Okay, so nice poem as usual. Wang Wei is a master craftsman and quite good at painting these scenes of a beautiful, peaceful, almost otherworldly nature.